Okay, welcome to another Climbing Talent development show with Alvaro, Rangel, and Udo Neumann. Today we are talking about the constraints-led approach, which is a one aspect of nonlinear pedagogy. And of course, there's a whole lot to talk about. We try to keep it short. And as this is meant as an introduction to the constraints-led approach, we try to keep it short. And especially, we want to give you some examples. That's the main thing.
The first thing that comes to mind whenever we're talking about something like this is language, and you've mentioned this before, and we've talked about it, especially you and I being in different countries. Maybe we think we're talking about the same thing, and it's good just to kind of lay a baseline of what we're talking about so that everybody gets a good idea. So when you're talking about nonlinear pedagogy, um, and how that applies to the constraints-led approach, you've created kind of this triangle, which is a really good representation of the approach that leads
Yes.
to a constraints-led approach coaching. So if you kind of want to go over it.
Yeah. Triangle has well three corners. It's the task. That's probably the most obvious what most coaches think about. And the nice thing about the constraints-led approach is that it's very much what climbing is about anyhow. So it's what many coaches are already doing. Let's talk about the task. It's very easy for us as climbing coaches to manipulate the task and to get a desired behavior. I just recently climbed on a really easy wall, but this time it was wet. It just had rained, and it was a lot harder. So if this had been done by my climbing coach, it would have been already, uh, yeah, manipulating the constraints and the affordances. Well, maybe Al, we should talk about constraints and affordances.
And I think something to highlight, because you said, oh, even this is essentially what climbing is. Like for me, especially competition bouldering is constraints-led approach. Like you basically say, here's you have some rules. The task itself is you have 4 minutes or 5 minutes, per boulder. Here's the start, here's the finish, and you have certain things that you're allowed to do and certain things you're not allowed to do. And you're the performer, and the environment can be, whatever competition you're at or inside of your gym for practice. But that's pretty much it. Like, and I think that's a really, really good way of thinking about it. Uh, and it leads into the affordances part, because when we think about intended beta, you almost lose that a little bit, because then you're trying to think about, you're not just thinking, oh, here's my task and here are my rules and I'm going to accomplish the task. You're starting to think about, like, oh, I wonder what this person was trying to get me to do, and that's something else altogether.
Yes, affordances are uh, what affords you. This is, I think, an artificial word, a word that doesn't exist in the dictionary, and it was invented to describe that something affords you a certain action. Now, and the detection of affordances is essential for any kind of, not only for bouldering competitions, obviously, but for any kind of problem solving. And there are huge differences in how capable people are in detecting affordances. It's of course context dependent. Like if you're a climber, you won't detect many affordances in underwater, maybe for action and for moving. Uh, but uh, in my mind, or according to my experience, the best climbers are the best in detecting affordances. Give you an example. If I'm showing an athlete like Jan Hoyer, or I shouldn't say showing, if I present a challenge to an athlete like Jan Hoyer, I want to be really deliberate of how I communicate the constraints, because he, on the other side, he will find affordances really, yeah, really well. So if I'm not very clear of what the constraints are, what he's not allowed to use. No, you're not allowed to use your elbow, or yes, you're allowed to use your pinky. Now, then he will, according to my how I put the challenge, he will use the available affordances to his advantage. And I think that's exactly what route setters do, right?
Yeah, exactly. And in this case, affordances, for lack of a better definition, is what the athlete can get away with doing. Uh, and for the kids, it is like that. So for me, a good example of something that we did like, I would, and we're going to go into specific examples. I'll pull this video up. But this is something that we would do in training camps quite a bit. And um, even before this step, we would just have a volume on the ground where we were asking people to just stand on it. Like the goal a lot of times was, for a lot of these kids, they didn't have, big volumes that they climbed on frequently, and they just were really uncomfortable on them. And so we'd have a volume on the ground for them to stand up and just see how their feet sat on the volume. And you'd say, okay, I just want you to stand on this volume right now. And you'd get the kid that would just stand on the edges on top of the volume, which as a coach, you're like, oh, well, you're like, you know what I mean, go do it. But that's the wrong answer, because for the kid, that was the affordance. Like, yeah, you didn't tell me I could stand on this top part. You just told me to stand on the volume, and I did. And so it sharpens your skill as a coach as well, because you have to be really, intentional with what you're asking of them. And so this is kind of going back to the triangle here. For a lot of us, when we do these essentially skill building exercises at the camp, we're almost working backwards, thinking, okay, here's a movement that we want the athletes to become more comfortable in, and then how can we modify the other aspects in order to kind of get that result. So in this case, being in standing and running on volumes, things like that. Um,
Yeah. It's even more than a movement, actually. It's more of a quality, a movement quality that we want to improve. And there's always this element of adaptability, so that they can adapt to changing environments. Now, to talk about the word environment is a little hidden behind the two of us. Can you move the picture? So that's one corner of the triangle. The green one is the environment. And what Al just was talking about, by not allowing the kids to stand on the edges of the volume, this would be a manipulation of their environment. So we talked about the task, which is very easy, smaller or bigger holes, to texture holes, or skipping moves, and the environment would be uh, things like the edges of the volume. That would be one aspect. But can you play the video again, because it had some other aspects? And as Al just described, we very often we feel that the coaches are almost in the same situation as the climbers. So often we find out about affordances and possible constraints only by doing it. No, at least in my case, I'm not. I don't know when I start a challenge or trying to get the athletes interested in the challenge. I don't know really what's going to happen, and then for me, it's just about seeing where they are at and then taking it from there. And in this case, you just see how this one coach, he's not standing on the volume anymore, because when we first started this challenge, the coaches were supporting the volumes, which of course leads to a totally different successful movement strategy. And I think that's a very good example of the constraints-led approach, is how you can foster certain qualities, or if you overlook something, you're actually doing more harm than good. If you supporting these volumes from the side, then they can pretty much, then the volumes are not going to move, and the athletes don't learn to land on top of the volume, or aligned to the ideal direction of loading. You just saw it with her, how the volume was moving to the right a little bit, was sliding to the right.
Yeah, and in this like we had they essentially teach different things, and I think that was the cool thing about it. They teach different things, but it wasn't like we were necessarily saying, oh, okay, this is why. I think if you start noticing if you notice, then we also have situations before where we would brace the volumes and we'd have them run around, and it was carrying momentum and figuring out what, basically just getting a feel for what the volumes feel like when you're running on them. And this is a pretty good example of that.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that it's per se not good to support the volume, but I think that's a nice example of how just by just changing if the volumes are supported with the coach's feed or not, you totally change the outcome and the benefits of this challenge.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I wanted to go back to this one because, like you said, I think even when we were doing that drill, we were thinking like, oh, safety wise, we want to make sure that these volumes are braced. And then afterwards, we're like, okay, they feel more comfortable on it. Let's just see what happens when we don't brace them anymore and how it affects. Like, it's not like we're telling them, okay, now that you're doing this, you have to land on the volume this way. Essentially, once we unbrace the volumes, they try it once and they slip on it, and then they start figuring out like what they can and can't do. And I think this is a good opportunity for us to say why a constraints-led approach is valuable versus, I guess, what would be the alternative. And for me, the alternative is uh, where essentially you get somebody 5 feet off the ground in a boulder where they have to do something with a volume that they maybe haven't seen before. That's the first time that they've done that. They come down, and as a coach, you're like, well, I just need you to rock over and trust your feet on this move. And what's the issue with that, Udo?
The issue is that they don't learn to adapt to different challenges, and also that it would be, this is what's called explicit learning. Like the coach, the know-it-all coach, would tell the athlete how to do things. And I think traditionally, it's very understandable that climbing is coached this way because it used to be really dangerous, and so the coach didn't want, a little bit like when we were bracing the volumes. We were afraid that athletes would get hurt, and if you're afraid of this, of course, you want to give distinct directions. You don't want basically you don't want the athletes to think by him or herself, because you have so much more experience, and you want to protect them from harm. But now, as we are training in a safe environment, we can be a little bit more brave and encouraging the athletes to figure out things by themselves. And even using the group, like if these volumes need to be braced, then they should be braced by other athletes. If you have a group, that brings me to another aspect that's often overlooked in the constraints-led approach. The environment would be also the group. So things like social facilitation, that the group is so positive for the learning process that the individual learns better through the group. And by involving the other athletes in embracing volumes and making sure that things are safe, I think that's already different and better for the athlete than if the coach does it, because it's more involvement. It's more of your peers, and it already gets a different quality then.
Yeah, and I think if you did a good job as setting up the environment, like we could just walk away and they continue to progress the challenge sometimes in that sense. Like it's almost like the group can come up with ideas that you wouldn't have come up with necessarily. Like, oh, what would happen if we do this? And uh, I think
Yeah.
it's almost like a
Uh,
organic in that way.
Yeah, but it's actually this is what some coaches criticize with the constraints-led approach, that it almost seems to be a little wishy-washy, or the role of the coach doesn't seem to be very strong. Why do we need a coach if it's just about setting the environment? Uh, but I think for us, it's almost more valuable to watch practice like this, because you learn so much about the athlete. And I would almost argue that an athlete that fails to identify the affordances, like landing on the volumes from the top, would have the same problems in the climbing competitions, to not being really smart in detecting affordances. And this is maybe the most valuable thing for me, that even as a coach, I can see them at work. I can see their mind working, and trying to figure out what's the best way to deal with these constraints.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, you would just have to see coaching from a different perspective a little bit, because part of that for me, so much of the coaching, I guess, was setting up that environment well before the camps even happened, and adapting to like, oh wait, this isn't the right level. And I think we'll get to that in here. Uh, I think one of the challenges of coaching climbing is that, if we're just putting if the task is just let's get to the top of this boulder, or something along those lines, sometimes the level's too high, and so what we get is just a let's repeat it over and over and figure out how to do it. And it's binary. You either do it or you don't, which I think I would like to go back to that point at some in the future, but it's just way too hard. The challenge is just way too hard for the individual, and so the learning is just too slow. You're basically waiting for chance that this person happens to do, five things right for the first time, that they do it, and that they're, going to reflect back and know that those are the five things that I did to be successful. And sometimes boulders can be like that. So we had this from last time that we did some of our chats, I guess, which was when we were trying to think about how to practice movement off the wall. And a big part of it was the challenge point. Um, if you want to chat about that for a little bit, Udo.
Yeah, this is where the top angle, the performer, comes into place. If you go back to the triangle of the constraints-led approach, or you might remember, on top it says the performer, and of course you cannot change a whole lot. If the performer is really short or really tall, there's nothing you can do about it. But if you think about the challenge point, what Al just mentioned, then it makes sense, because you in a group, in most group settings, like if you're talking 13-year-olds, there can be 1 foot apart in terms of reach and length and span. And then just thinking about how you can find challenge point for everybody, for all the individuals in your group, is really interesting. And I find, once you start thinking this way, it becomes almost really easy, to see, okay, if I tell this really tall boy to not do this and this and this is not allowed. So I put constraints on him, and the really short girl is, gets more affordances, or in this way. Then with a little practice, it's possible to keep a whole group at their individual challenge point, at the challenge point of the individual athletes.
Yeah, so we have a kind of example from some of the camps that we would do, which is essentially, I don't think this was even planned. If I remember, like, we didn't have this planned as one of the drills that we were going to do, but I think it was more like, oh, I noticed that some of the kids were having a hard time with something, and we had just this like little sliver of a wall, and so we just decided to do kind of this idea of this drill to just jump up to a jug and change the foot over and over again to make it, from like the least risky to the most risky foot. And in the corner, you basically see like we changed eventually, like the last level that they were getting to was this dual text upside down foot. Uh, and I think that has, I've realized that that's always become really valuable is taking just one thing and regressing it and progressing it as much as possible in either direction. Because for exactly for what you're saying, it's like we got so many attempts, maybe in like the 15 minutes that they were spending there, uh, they learned more about that kind of move than they would trying a single boulder for like 2 hours. Just because so much of that idea of throwing weight into the foot uh, is applicable to hundreds of boulder problems later on.
Yeah. Also, this element of changing direction, converting horizontal momentum into vertical to step up into the wall. And then, of course, with the dual texture, with the slippery hold, you have to do it with more authority. You have to get it really right. It's actually really related to running over volumes. It would be, in my mind, it's the next step. It could be like two lessons, and the first would be running over the volumes, and then with the additional constraints of change of direction. This could be a challenge for the second part of this session.
And for so many of these things, it's like physics, For like, if you're one
Yeah,
of those people, you think like, oh, well, physics, if I'm putting the force in the right direction, it's never going to slip. But that's, your logical brain and then your rational brain versus your, okay, what's the worst case scenario when this foot slips is I'm going to slam into the wall. And so you have to provide an opportunity for them to kind of work up to that. And it, if the first time they see a move like that is 10 feet off the ground at a competition trying to qualify for whatever they're trying to qualify for, it's not a good place. There's way too many other constraints in the environment for them to actually learn there. And going back to basically the binary part of it, I really do think that whenever you're making, like, what I've found really useful is that it is kind of like a pass fail thing with where you kind of keep the constraints, you can lower them low enough, but essentially we're jumping up to this jug, and either you do it right and you get the jug, or you don't do it right and you're coming off with low kind of investment, in the sense that, well, they just try it over again and we'll just make it a little bit easier. Because in that sense, you I do appreciate the fact that, like, if you can kind of narrow the constraints down as much as possible, then they can really take a good lesson away from it. It's, oh, well, I put a lot of pressure into it and I was able to do the move, versus I don't put enough pressure into it and I don't do the move. And so it gives you really clear cut, like, they learn valuable lessons off of that. Because, if you add holds on, then afterwards I'd say the next progression from something like this is starting off of the wall, and having a similar move, but where you don't have the momentum of running into the wall. But even just by adding there, then you add a bunch of other uh, constraints that they have to account for. And they just take this part of it, which is when I throw my foot into the wall, I have to put a lot of force in this direction, and they just layer that on top of the other information as well.
yeah, yeah. And if you think back to our last of the example in our last show from Meiringen, where Adam was struggling with the first move a little bit, this stand up into the two finger pocket, you know, I think that would be fantastic preparation for exactly that. So what they were just practicing is exactly what's asked very often, about this rather simple physics: action, reaction, directions, momentum.
Yeah, and so
And
maybe for people on podcasts who might be listening to this and not be able to see the video, uh,
yes, yes,
what's going on here is that we've essentially just like a small piece of the wall where we just swap the foot, a really bad, like, volumey foot, so it's got a lot of surface area on the wall, and the athletes are doing a run start basically, and the foot gets so bad. And for most of them, the first reaction once you turn the dual text over is like, oh, okay, well you can't do that anymore. And then so it was like, for us it was really valuable because it's like, no, no, you definitely can do it. It's just that you have to come at it from the right direction. For people who don't have, I think it's really nice to be able to just change the wall constantly, do whatever you want on it, but you might be in a gym where that's just not necessarily feasible. Um, but let's say you've set kind of a dyno that starts off the wall. Something that's really useful to regress that is for them to try to run up into the position. Um, Similarly, basically like, well, let's do the move by just trying to run up and standing up into it. And it's kind of little ideas like that that I guess the goal is to just regress the move and bring the challenge point to be more in line with whatever your athlete is at. Because if you can continually do that, if you just really, really push it as tight as possible, the learning is significantly better for the athlete.
Yes. And one thing it just came into my mind when we were talking about like the angle. Like what you're seeing now is most of them run straight into the wall in a like, how you call it, like straight, no angle. They
Perpendicular.
don't come
Perpendicular.
perpendicular,
Yeah.
the perpendicular to the wall. They run into to the wall in this example. And this came because we had three of them practicing at the same time, and the other ones were waiting in line. And now that I'm watching this, I'm almost thinking, like, maybe in some cases it would have been better to run from an angle, not perpendicular. But of course, since they were practicing with not too much space to the side, that was the only way to run into the wall was perpendicular. So that might have been a good thing because we were kind of constraining the way they were running into the wall, but somehow they couldn't really detect, like, if the affordance, if it would have been better to run from an angle, this would have been missed in this setup.
Yeah.
Right.
No, I agree.
Does this make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, when there's a window to the right
So,
side, we can't run from that side.
yeah, because this is something you see really often, that even on high level competitions, that climbers fail to detect the best angle to run into a run up start.
Yeah, I think it's it's kind of one of those things where for a lot of athletes, I think when they start thinking boulders, they treat them like pattern recognition. uh, it's almost like, well, I've done a version of this boulder before, and now I'm going to apply that. Like, these are the things that I did when that, and that's not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is that you start recognizing like situations, um, and feelings more generally, like, this is what this foot feels like at this angle. And I think that men's number 2 in Meiringen was a good example, because you see a lot of those athletes, they've done climbs like that before, but what it's really about is like they just know that foot at that angle and how much weight they have to throw in a certain direction. And so if you start thinking like, oh well, this is a popular boulder, I'm going to make sure that I can do this boulder. um, yes, that can sometimes work, and you will sometimes get boulders that are very similar, in which case like your body might remember this is what the move felt like. But the reality is, setting is such a moving target that you want to kind of draw on the things that are going to be really helpful, that are going to apply from as much from this boulder to the other boulder.
Yeah.
And so that's where these constraint-led approaches are going to be most useful. Also, because part of it is, like you were talking about the environment in terms of just having like a group of 10 kids running back and forth onto the wall. That in itself, like you said, you start to notice who takes 10 attempts for every one attempt for another kid. That's very common. And part of that
Yeah.
might be that you're very self-conscious about, slamming into the wall. And that's an opportunity then. You notice that and you see this person, okay, this person tries 10 times to this person's 1.
Yeah,
both of those are problematic in a certain way. Because if this person's trying 10 times and they're always, succeeding, then it's like, as a coach, am I not making this challenging enough for you? Okay, that's an issue. Second, are you only willing to try things that you're going to be successful at because you want to seem successful at them? Okay, that's something else that you can notice from this. The other one, is this person not trying this at all? Okay, and why is that? Or is it because you're self-conscious about, not being successful in front of a group of people? And those are so beneficial for a coach to see.
yeah, 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 absolutely. And this is again going back to the challenge point, right? That because when I mention social facilitation, it's a good thing. So the individual is better because of the group, or performs better and is trying harder. But there's also the opposite. The group can uh, distract us from being trying new stuff. We tend to only try what we know in the group setting. And again, this is something this is really interesting for the coach to observe. Because again, if it happens in practice, it certainly will be an issue in competition and under stress.
That's why those situations are also really valuable for you as a coach, especially if you coach a team where you start noticing the social aspects that, like you said, they're going to come up in competition if they have a fear of performing in front of a group because they're worried about, seeming like incompetent, I guess, like whatever their insecurity might be about climbing in front of other people. Like if it shows itself in a group, and then you have to approach it the same way. So the environment is too challenging in that situation. Like maybe you have to take this person and put them in a different situation that's going to help them build confidence to work towards another larger, more demanding environment. And that's all part of it. So I think
Yeah.
really important, as you mentioned, not to discount the social side of the challenge.
Yes. That's and also like talking of the environment, we really have to keep in mind that our modern environments are a lot safer, a lot more even. We have even ground almost everywhere, except when we're in nature. We have right angles. So we live in a much less challenging environment compared to people from 60, 70 years ago. And you might think, well, why bother? But I really think that it messes with your ability to problem solve. I think it's when we did, for example, obstacle parcours in our camps, Al, even the athletes that are really fantastic climbers in the certain settings, they show some weaknesses if the challenge is slightly what they don't usually do. So slightly off. They are not as competent as you would expect in challenges that are slightly different. And I think that's one thing that comes from our rather boring and man-made environments that we spend a lot of time in. Like even things like you have a outdoor competition, like in Vale in former times. And it could get really cold in Vale. So you have an athlete who never climbed outdoors, and she's getting cold hands, because and this is something she's never dealt with. And again, I think we really have to make our environments as diverse and yeah, bring them back basically to an unorderly nature environment very often. And I think that's overlooked really often. Like, it's not only the things we talk of really often that people practice too much in 2 dimensions and not enough 3 dimensionally. That would be environment thing, but it's also the shades in between. That we always have to consider that a modern boulder gym is a really challenging environment, but like aspects like weather, temperature, wetness are still not a part of this environment. So it's still a rather uniform man-made environment. And I think we're shooting ourselves in the foot if we don't prepare our athlete for that. The environment could be much more diverse.
Yeah, I think if you just take it from like how you respond to this, you can see it one of two ways, which is okay, the environment became more challenging, and then you can become really frustrated about the environment becoming challenging, and so that might look like, oh, my skin hurts, or my skin is dry, the conditions aren't ideal, and you have certain athletes that respond. I think a person that's been very comfortable with working in a constraints-led approach is going to respond as like, oh, well, this is one of the new constraints that I'm dealing with now. um, there's like an acceptance there, and so for me, a lot of times warming up is about acceptance. Okay, these are the constraints today. I'm tired, my skin hurts, this is my third day on, I'm jet lagged. Like, you either say, oh, well, things are going south really quickly, like this is not going to be a good competition for me, and that's a mental approach to it, or you see them as part of the constraints to, the the day, essentially. Like, okay, well, that's a new constraint. That means that because then essentially you're gonna have uh, solutions, or I guess you're gonna have an idea of what you're. It's gonna modify how you climb that day. Okay, my skin's really bad, so I think for fear of not bleeding, I might adjust how many attempts I do, things like that. Like, I'm very tired, so I have to climb a little bit with more momentum because certain moves I'm just not going to be able to control like I used to, and those are different. And if you're constantly training in that mindset, you become a little bit more resilient. Like you said, if all of a sudden it just gets really cold, so that's just a new part of the challenge. It's part of the game, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, one word or term you can think about this is bandwidth. You're basically increasing your bandwidth or your tolerance, for condition and for conditions. And uh, again, this is a really important aspect. And I think many coaches underestimate. You have a certain movement, and you think that's really stable, but actually it's not. As soon as you try to speed up this move, regardless what it is, you might even use different muscle groups for the faster move or for the slower move. So it's not that that we are moving like robots, and there's it's hugely beneficial to increase this bandwidth so that somebody can fluidly react. Oh, this hold now feels a little bit moist or a little bit slippery, or maybe it wasn't brushed in the competition. Couldn't get brushed. Now that competitors have to brush themselves, they couldn't reach the hold. And if this is part of your practice, that you're constantly forced to react to varying constraints, I think it will pay off nicely. It's really beneficial.
Yeah, in practices, a lot of the athletes I worked with are gotten really used to like them doing the boulder, then me immediately changing the foot or whatever they just did over, and asking
Yeah,
them to do the same boulder 5 times, and essentially because in either direction. And like I mentioned, it's hard. Sometimes you don't have a gym where that's a possibility, so you have to use some. You have to be creative in different ways in terms of, if you can, add a hold potentially afterwards, or I mean, removing things, or just saying you can't use that. But I would just take feet off, change the foot. Okay, you did that move with that foot. Let me change it to this foot, and they learn a lot from situations like that. And initially, it's you can tell how they respond to it. If they respond to it initially, it might be annoyed. Oh, well, I just did the boulder. You're like picking on me. Uh,
but I think the buy-in is better than if you ask them to repeat, for example, the same boulder. If
yeah,
you increase the challenge, I think if they're ambitious, as most athletes are, they're very willing to try the new challenge. and they very often they appreciate it. And I think from the coach's side, uh, in most gyms, especially if you're not coaching like national teams or so, it's very often it's divided between the setters, and you're not allowed to set your own problems. Also for the athletes, even successful ones, in most commercial gyms, they're not allowed to change anything. But with a little bit of creativity, I think you can do a lot. If you just think about it, if you don't allow the athlete to match, for example, then some really easy problems can become really challenging if you're not allowed to match, or you're not allowed to use part of the holes, or your leg is broken and you only can use one foot on a slab, of course. Then you can create some fantastic challenges without even changing anything with a setting.
Yeah, I will mention one potential thing to think about when you're doing something like that is, very frequently nowadays they have holds that have the inserts to cover the bolt hole. You know what I'm talking about? And so a lot of times, like, I wouldn't cover it because they just don't work super well. And I'd just be like, tell the athletes, okay, well, you're not allowed to sink your thumb in there and use it. And they get used to that as part of their constraint, and then they carry it over into a competition where that's not a thing anymore. And I've had this as a problem where then I'm like, you also have to have situations where they learn essentially to make sure they know what the constraints are and give them enough practice where it's by any means necessary, where they're digging in behind a volume and using the screw, you know, because you do notice how creative some of those athletes are in finding all that stuff. And that goes back to just um, when you're in performance mode and when you're in practice mode, what the
Yeah,
goals of those
yeah.
modes are.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the World Cups were decided by people that use the bolt hold, the bolt hole. So, and again, now as a coach, if you see something like this, it's also a little bit of the culture that you're creating with your athletes, and it should be, yeah, like even if you say, this wasn't allowed or so, but part of you should be proud of your athletes that they detected this. And part of you should be a little bit ashamed that you didn't see it yourself, if you didn't see it yourself. And on the very high, like last year when we did the show with Benny Hartmann, or what we've been doing in Germany, you often misleading your athletes, or confusing them, or directing their attention to something that's not really important, and take it away from something that would be important to detect.
Yeah, can you give me an example, like in that
Yeah,
situation?
just a primitive example is if you're playing a little bit with expectancies, expectations. Like you talk a lot about dynamic moves, and then you have them climb something. Like even in World Cups, when these skate moves became popular, there were often it was easier to just balance across and just do them in a really controlled fashion. And one time in Vail again, I think like in 2013 or so, Anna Stör, who was the best climber of this time, a female climber, she almost didn't make semis because she tried to do a running skating move all the time. And it was Alex Puccio who did it really easily, and of course had the top flash the problem. And Anna almost got kicked out because of her attempts to do the skating move. So this should be definitely part of your preparation if you prepare your athletes for competitions. There should be, if they're a little bit advanced, but I think you can start this really early. And from my observations, even kids really appreciate it. You can be a little bit misleading. Like you talk about one thing, and they get really annoyed by you always repeating the same thing. And then you have them try something really uh, 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 something where the opposite of what you just described is really beneficial. And this is also a good exercise for them to think for themselves. You can find out what athletes are maybe giving you lip service, or trying to please you first, and climbing the problem second. Or again, it's also good fun, by the way. And these cognitive aspects should be certainly a part of your preparation.
Yeah, I think like you mentioned the response to how basically like when an athlete does something that maybe you weren't anticipating as a coach, the response to that is really important for that reason because you want them to basically continue that thought of like okay, well, what are the rules, what am I allowed to do? Okay, I'm going to do the task, and not so much thinking this extra step, which is what does the coach want me to do here necessarily, and then doing that, because then that gets you into the mindset of what does the route setter want me to do here necessarily.
Yeah.
um, and sometimes that's useful. Like I think that's a tool that athletes can have in terms of like, okay, I'm not exactly sure what this boulder looks like, but I have an idea, and that can be useful. But you also want to be able to completely think from the this is my start, this is my finish, how do I get to the top using everything that I have available to me. And those are two different ways of thinking about it, because one leads you, like you said, if Anna is, if somebody thinks, oh well, this is a skate, and for 4 minutes all they do is try a skate because it's set up very similar and it looks like that's what's popular nowadays, versus somebody who's like, well, this could go as a skate, it also looks like I could walk across. And maybe you have plan A and plan B, and you have a way of switching between the two. It's a good transition into, I think we can wrap up today's episode with an example from the Meiringen World Cup. If you want to set this up for us, Udo.
Yeah, this is the second problem in the finals, for the females in Meiringen, and I think it got four. Four women could do this. Could climb up to the zone, right? If I remember correctly. And here you see it from all different angles. Um, and I think that's really interesting. This problem is really interesting in terms of detecting affordances. And this is what I find enjoyable if you watch even the live stream, because I was thinking that the zone hole that she just stamped on, that it would be maybe too much around the corner to be really beneficial. But then, of course, on the screen, you really cannot tell. Uh, and you see different versions. And we were just thinking, Ella and I were thinking that this is a spectacular problem. It's a fantastic problem, but still it affords these four different ways, and it's not very constrained. It would be easy to make this quite a bit more challenging, this problem. And we wanted to talk a little bit about what you would do to prepare your athletes to have more bandwidth in a problem like this. Like what you would really change hands-on with
Yeah,
this problem.
and I think like if we were, because one of the hard parts, and especially this is how when you hear the term like a boulder got overcooked for a competition, you know the the route setters also have constraints that they have to work with, and part of that is not just guessing the level, but will a person figure this out in 4 minutes? And so that leads to, there's the hold essentially on the highest volume, the right hand, where most people are swinging off of, and it has an in cut, and in cut holds are generally going to lead for more affordances, and you can see that. And I think one of the cool things about somebody like Orion in this clip is that she realizes like she has a good understanding in this situation, like, oh, what, I can take a swing on that hold with both hands. And so that's a really good indication of somebody who
This
sees the affordances of what that hold allows them to do, essentially.
Yes. So if we would take the hold, we're talking about the hold that Natalia had just now in her right hand, and it's a huge hold. But inside, it's this. Did they put a Spacks on the hole? Do you know, or is this as positive?
It looks like a jib inside of it, so I think no matter
Yeah,
what, it's going to
I
have
would
it
think
kind of like an incut behind it. And
yes.
you can tell because
Yeah,
of the swing they're taking on it. Like that's kind of the
exactly,
indication.
exactly, exactly. And this would be like a very easy. I mean, if I had seen this as a coach of a potential competitor in the finals, I would try to make sure that my athlete would be able to climb this thing without the jib in this hold.
Yeah, and maybe the boulder would just be that's one of the things where it's like especially you don't know what the time constraints were to try to get the boulder for the right level, and usually there's going to be some level of tweaking that they might do based on how semifinals went. And but for a camp, for learning situations, for me that would be the first thing. Okay, we all did it this way. I'm really curious. Let's see if we can do this boulder without this jib on. And because like you mentioned, the first example is perfect. We give everybody an opportunity to see their limits and learn where their limits are. Like, okay, you went with both hands to that jug. I think an incorrect response as a coach is like an egocentric where, oh man, like the boulder sucks basically, which is not the case. You should be rewarding, you should essentially be encouraging the athlete for being like, dude, you found that, that's really good that you found that, because I didn't even know necessarily that that would be something that would happen. um, but then immediately after that you can kind of be like, okay, well, we figured out how to do it this way. Let's see if we can take this jib off and find out you know how you approach this boulder problem. And it's going to be really similar. And I'm willing to bet that they did it that way, but then maybe it's just, okay, well, this seems too hard for like the amount of time that we would be giving the athletes. Does that sound right?
Yeah, 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 absolutely. And uh, just as a last thought, so just imagine you leave this. Your problem was successful. Your athlete was successful under the circumstances, and you leave it like this. Then basically, what you're fostering is the ideal behavior for these constraints with the in-cut jib. And if the jib is gone, if they have nothing in car to hold the swing, they don't have any strategy for that. They don't have any tools for that. And this is why I think it's so nice to consider the constraints-led approach. Because it would have been so easy to to manipulate the constraints that she would have learned how to deal with the situation without the jib.
I am willing to bet that if you took the jib off, so let's say we were doing this at a camp, and if you took the jib off and the athletes saw that you took the jib off, because another interesting part would be, I think this is fun, you tell them to walk away, you change the boulder, you don't tell them how you change the boulder, and you'll get an idea of who's very perceptive, like who actually pays attention. But let's say you take the jib off in front of them, and I'm willing to bet that Orion would not try that beta again. Like she would know that that's just not going to work, um,
Yeah.
potentially.
Yeah.
I think there's
And
still a
we don't
chance.
know how easy this jib was to watch from the ground. Maybe we should ask one of the competitors to find out. Because if they hadn't seen the jib, if it was, but it looks as if from the side you can see it. No, but I totally agree. I totally agree. This all these finalists are exceptional affordance detectors. This is probably where what's the big that sets them apart the most in this field, and especially somebody like Oriane. Uh, she's so perceptive.
Yeah, and there was more instances during this competition where it was, you saw similar, like in the hand jam problem, same thing. Like they see the hand jam and they're like, I think I see what they want me to do here, but I can do this instead. And I think athletes that are able to, be really secure it's because they've seen a lot of situations where somebody told them, okay, this is what you're doing, and not so much thinking about what people want them to do, but more just thinking like, okay, well, this is the top of the boulder, and I'm going to get to it with whatever is necessary. And it's even if you give them a brand new hold, a hold that they've never held before, uh, they start to just, it's a lot of that stuff takes over. Well, it's like this angle, in this angle, I can probably do this with that. Like I've felt the texture. This is kind of like the amount of friction that I feel like I have, and um, that's kind of what the having a constraints-led approach teaches you, is how to detect, those things that carry over from one situation into the next one.
When we do this at camps, one aspect is really that you learn about the athletes a lot faster than you could if you have a conversation. If you would ask questions, there you see them in action, you see them in what they're actually doing. And so I think it's also a very efficient way of coaching. That's one big part of it.
Yeah, I agree. All right. Well, thank you, Udo. That was fun. I'm sure we'll
Thank you, Al.
revisit this. I think all this stuff is going to build on itself. So in the future, if we have a conversation about another subject, it'll probably be put in the context of a constraint-led approach, and that might even help just, make it more clear about what we're talking about as well. So on to the next one.